There's a part of your brain that shuts down every time you fall asleep. It's the part responsible for self-reflection, the inner voice that catches absurdities and says, "Wait, this can't be right." During dreams it goes quiet, which is why you never question the impossible things happening around you. 24 centuries ago, a Chinese philosopher noticed that blind spot without knowing a thing about neuroscience. He wrote 90 words about a man who dreamed he was a butterfly and couldn't tell, when he woke, which one he really was. Those words launched one of the longest-running arguments in philosophy. Tonight, we're following that argument through ancient parables, funeral drumming, quantum physics, and a comic book about the Matrix. There's a passage in an ancient Chinese text that's only about 90 words long. In the original classical Chinese, it's even shorter, a handful of brushstrokes on bamboo strips, and those 90 words have been argued about for 24 centuries. Not because they're obscure or because they contain some hidden code that scholars have been trying to crack, but because they describe something so simple that it shouldn't be a problem at all, and somehow, impossibly, it is. A man falls asleep. He dreams he's a butterfly. The butterfly flutters around doing butterfly things, visiting flowers, riding the wind, completely unaware that it's actually a man having a dream. Then the man wakes up. He's back in his body, back in his room, back in the world he recognizes. And he finds he can't answer a question that sounds almost ridiculous. Was he a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, or is he now a butterfly dreaming it's a man? That's it. That's the whole parable. The passage ends with a phrase that, in Chinese philosophy, carries the weight of centuries of debate. The writer calls this gap, this impossibility of knowing which side of the dream you're on, the transformation of things, wuhua. It became one of the most debated concepts in all of Chinese thought, not because it answers anything, but because it names something most of us would rather not look at directly, the idea that identity is never fixed. That the boundary between you and everything you're not might be thinner than a membrane of sleep. Now the parable sits at the end of a chapter called On the Equality of Things, Kiwulan, and that title matters because it tells you what the writer was actually doing. This wasn't a bedtime story or a whimsical thought experiment. It was the final move in a much larger argument, an argument that said all the distinctions humans draw between things, right and wrong, beautiful and ugly, waking and sleeping, are perspectival. Not fake exactly, but not solid either, not walls. More like lines drawn in water. And here's the thing about perspectivism as a philosophical position. It's not relativism. It's not saying nothing is real or everything is equally true. It's saying something subtler and more uncomfortable than that. Every viewpoint reveals something and hides something, and there is no viewpoint that reveals everything and hides nothing. No God's eye camera, no master angle. At the time this was written, roughly 2,400 years ago, Chinese philosophy was dominated by two schools locked in what seemed like permanent combat. The Confucians said they knew what was right about governance, about morality, about the proper way to conduct a life. The Mohists said the Confucians were wrong and they had the real answers. The two sides argued endlessly, each side insisting the other was confused, each building elaborate systems to prove they alone had the correct view. And the writer of the butterfly dream looked at both of them and said something devastating. The very act of choosing sides in this debate proves you've already lost sight of the Tao. The moment you pick a position and defend it, you've narrowed your vision to one angle of something that doesn't have angles. You've mistaken your particular hollow for the whole wind. And that metaphor, the hollow and the wind, isn't mine. It comes from the passage that sits just before the butterfly dream, a passage most people skip, but one that changes everything about how you read what follows. A man named Ziki of South Wall sits down and tells his student something that sounds like a confession. Today I have lost myself. Which is a strange thing for a teacher to say. You don't expect that kind of admission from someone who's supposed to be the authority in the room. And then, instead of explaining what he means in abstract philosophical terms, he describes three kinds of music. First, the piping of humans, flutes and instruments, things people build and blow into. Second, the piping of earth, wind moving through 10,000 hollow spaces in mountains and cliffs and trees, each cavity singing a different note depending on its shape. Some moan, some whistle, some roar. If you've ever stood on a cliff on a windy night, you know the sound, the whole landscape humming like a broken organ. Third, the piping of heaven, which is the thing that makes each hollow sing in its own unique way, without any visible musician behind it. No conductor, no master player, just the breath of something moving through differently shaped openings, and when the breath stops, the hollows go silent. They don't have music of their own, they only sing when something passes through them. Sit with that for a moment, because if the piping of heaven has no player, then all the competing philosophies, every school that insists it has the right answer, every tradition claiming to own the truth, are just different shaped hollows making different sounds as the same invisible wind moves through them. None of them is the music, all of them are, and none of them can hear themselves from the outside. And then right after that image has had time to settle, the wind, the hollows, the invisible musician who isn't there, the butterfly dream arrives. 90 words placed right at the end of this chapter about the equality of all perspectives. And in context, the dream takes on a different weight. It's not just a thought experiment about personal identity. It's the final note in a symphony about the impossibility of standing outside your own experience. The dreamer and the dreamed are two more hollows. Two more shapes the breath passes through, and you lying in your bed, listening to these words, cannot know which one is playing and which one is being played. You can't even know if there's a difference. The butterfly dream is 90 words long. It takes about 30 seconds to read. And 24 centuries of philosophy across dozens of traditions and thousands of commentaries haven't been enough to close the gap those words opened. The question is still live, it's still unanswered, and maybe that's the point. The dream wasn't designed to be closed. It was designed to stay open, like a window you can't shut, letting in whatever breeze happens to be blowing. Those 90 words weren't written by a sage on a mountain top. They came from a man who was born in one of the most despised places in the ancient Chinese world. His name was Zhuangzi, or at least that's the name that survived an honorific really meaning Master Zhuang. His personal name was probably Zhou. We don't know much about his actual life beyond scattered references in ancient texts, and what we do know comes mostly from the book that bears his name, which is itself a complicated, unstable thing we'll get to shortly. But the basics are these. He was born around 369 BCE in the state of Song. Song in the politics of ancient China was something like being from the wrong side of every border at once. The Song people were descendants of the conquered Shang dynasty. When the Zhou overthrew the Shang and established a new ruling order centuries before Zhuangzi's birth, the Shang survivors were resettled in Song, and the dominant Zhou lineage states never let them forget where they came from. Song was weak, its army was a joke, its people were mocked openly in the courts and stories of other states. There are actually comedy routines preserved in ancient Chinese texts that use a man from Song as the punchline, the ancient Chinese equivalent of starting a joke with "so a guy walks into a bar." That was Zhuangzi's country. And then roughly the year Zhuangzi died, around 286 BCE, the state of Qi came and destroyed Song entirely, swallowed it, erased it from the map. So Zhuangzi grew up in a country that was despised while it existed and then ceased to exist at all. He was born into humiliation and outlived it only because he died around the same time his country did. You might expect that kind of background to produce anger, or ambition, or at the very least a certain hunger to prove yourself, to be taken seriously by the world that laughed at you and your people. But Zhuangzi went the other direction entirely. He didn't want to prove the world wrong. He didn't want anything from the world at all. There's a story, and it's one of the most famous in all of Chinese literature, about the time the king of Chu sent 2 official emissaries to offer Zhuangzi the position of prime minister. This wasn't a small honor. Chu was one of the most powerful states in the Warring States period. Being offered its prime ministership was like being handed the keys to a small empire. Wars had been fought for lesser titles. Men had betrayed their families for less. Zhuangzi didn't even look up from his fishing rod. He asked the emissaries a question. He said, "I've heard that in Chu there's a sacred turtle. It's been dead for 3,000 years. The king keeps its shell wrapped in silk, displayed in a carved box in the ancestral temple where people come to worship it. Now, if that turtle had a choice, would it rather be dead and venerated in a temple, or alive and dragging its tail through the mud?" The emissaries didn't hesitate. Alive, they said, obviously. Of course the turtle would rather be alive in the mud. "Get out of here," Zhuangzi told them. "I too will drag my tail through the mud." And that was that. He went back to fishing. The prime ministership of Chu refused without a heartbeat of hesitation, because the mud was not a consolation prize, it was the whole point. What makes this more than a colorful anecdote is that it's perfectly consistent with everything else we know about him. Zhuangzi wasn't performing the role of the humble sage who turns down the crown to make a philosophical statement and then secretly waits for someone to write it down. He genuinely did not want it. The mud was not a metaphor. It was the preference, the actual, honest-to-God preference of a man who'd spent his life watching the world and decided that the things most people chase are the very things most likely to destroy them. He'd seen powerful men ruined by power. He'd watched clever men outsmart themselves into catastrophe. And he'd noticed that the turtle in the shrine, the one wrapped in silk, honored for centuries, was still, at the end of the day, dead. All the veneration in the world couldn't change that. Now there's something important here that gets lost when people talk about Zhuangzi as just another Taoist sage, interchangeable with Laozi. He and Laozi, the figure associated with the Daedejing, are usually grouped together as if they're two halves of the same tradition, two faces of the same coin. But scholars have increasingly come to believe that Zhuangzi may never have even read the Daedejing. The two texts are very different animals. The Daedejing is terse, compressed, almost aphoristic, short, controlled phrases that read like a manual for rulers who want to govern wisely. It's political at its core. Zhuangzi's writing is the opposite of all of that, sprawling, irreverent, full of talking animals and absurd parables and long conversations between people who may or may not have existed. Where the Daedejing says Tao, Zhuangzi often substitutes the word heaven. Where the Daedejing compresses, Zhuangzi expands and meanders and doubles back on himself for the pleasure of doubling back. Where one text whispers instructions to kings, the other laughs at the idea that kings deserve instructions. Zhuangzi wasn't the disciple of a tradition. He was something stranger, a man who arrived at similar territory through a completely different temperament. Like two travelers reaching the same mountain from opposite sides of a continent, speaking different languages and barely recognizing each other when they finally meet at the summit. They're both there, they both see the same view, but the paths they took and the reasons they climbed have almost nothing in common. That independence is part of what makes Zhuangzi so difficult to categorize and so easy to love. He wasn't carrying anyone else's flag. He wasn't continuing a program someone else started. He was just him, a man in the mud thinking. But the book that carries his name is stranger even than the man. Almost half of it was thrown away by a single editor, and the parts that survived were written by people who couldn't agree on what Zhuangzi actually meant. The text we call the Zhuangzi, the one you can pick up in a bookstore today or find in a dozen different English translations online, has 33 chapters, but it used to have 52. Around 300 CE, more than 5 centuries after Zhuangzi's death, a scholar named Gu Xiang sat down with the manuscript and decided to cut. He removed nearly 40% of the original text, 19 chapters gone. And he didn't try to hide what he was doing. He wasn't sheepish about it. Gu Xiang openly admitted that he imposed his own philosophical preferences on what stayed and what went. He decided which chapters were authentic and which were spurious, and since he was the only person alive with access to the complete manuscript, his judgment was the end of the conversation. We don't know what those 19 chapters contained. We don't know what ideas they explored, what stories they told, what parables got tossed. That knowledge is gone with a completeness that's hard to sit with, like finding out that someone recorded a long conversation between two brilliant people and then erased every other sentence and called the rest the full transcript. Of the 33 chapters that survived Gu Xiang's editing, only the first 7 are widely attributed to Zhuangzi himself. Scholars call these the inner chapters, and they're the ones most people mean when they say they've read the Zhuangzi. The remaining 26 were almost certainly written by multiple hands over several generations. Followers who thought they understood the master's teachings, dissidents who thought he'd gotten something importantly wrong, and synthesizers who tried to blend his ideas with other schools. Some of these later authors leaned toward a thinker named Yang Zhu, who preached a radical form of individualism. The man was famous for saying he wouldn't pluck a single hair from his head to benefit the entire world. Others were what scholars call primitivists, thinkers who rejected civilization entirely and wanted humanity to return to some pre-social state before tools and language ruined everything. Still others were syncretists, people who tried to smooth over the contradictions between Zhuangzi and Confucianism and Moism, contradictions that Zhuangzi himself would have probably found hilarious, since his entire philosophical project suggested that smoothing over contradictions was a fool's errand. You can almost hear him laughing at the idea of someone trying to make his ideas compatible with the Confucians. Compatible with what? He spent half the book putting absurd speeches in Confucius's mouth. So the book called Zhuangzi is not really a book by one person. It's a centuries-long argument disguised as a single text. A conversation among people who often couldn't agree on what they were even talking about, and yet all of them felt strongly enough about the original 7 chapters to keep writing, keep responding, keep adding their voices to a text that was already, by its very nature, designed to resist any single reading. And every time you encounter a passage from the Zhuangzi and think you understand what it's saying, you might be hearing Zhuangzi himself, the voice from the inner chapters, the man who dragged his tail through the mud. Or you might be hearing someone who lived 100 years later and had a fundamentally different understanding of what the whole thing was about, and you can't always tell which. The text doesn't want you to be able to tell. And here's what's easy to miss, and what most introductions to the Zhuangzi skip over entirely. That instability, the multi-voiced, multi-authored, deeply uncertain nature of the text is actually part of what makes it work. Maybe even the central thing that makes it brilliant, rather than merely interesting. A text about the dissolution of fixed positions was written by people who couldn't fix their own positions relative to each other. A text about the impossibility of pinning down the truth was assembled by people who couldn't agree on what the truth was. The medium and the message are, whether by accident or design, perfectly matched. And then there's the language itself. Zhuangzi, or whoever wrote chapter 27, described 3 kinds of rhetoric that the text uses, sometimes all at once, sometimes cycling through them within a single paragraph. The first kind is lodged words, passages that put ideas in the mouths of famous historical figures, like Confucius or the Yellow Emperor, to borrow their authority. If Zhuangzi wanted to say something provocative, he'd sometimes put it in Confucius's mouth, so the idea carried the weight of a name people already respected. The second kind is repeated words, quotations from respected elders, meant to add credibility through the gravity of tradition. And then there's the third kind, goblet words, jian. The name comes from a very specific object, a self-tipping wine vessel, a goblet balanced so precisely on a pivot that when you fill it with wine, the weight shifts and it tips over, spilling everything. You pour again, it fills and spills again. You can never get it to stay full. That's what goblet words do. They say something and then the saying tips over. The argument builds and then it empties itself. The text fills itself with meaning and then contradicts that meaning in the next passage, offering a position and then pulling the floor out from under it. So the very rhetoric of the Zhuangzi enacts the philosophical instability it's describing. The words won't hold still, which is, of course, exactly the point. If the transformation of things means that nothing stays fixed, not identity, not truth, not the distinction between dream and waking, then the language describing that principle shouldn't stay fixed either. The medium and the message are doing the same thing. So what does a book that argues with itself actually say? It starts with something enormous. The very first thing Zhuangzi wanted you to encounter, the opening image of chapter 1, the first words of the inner chapters, was not an argument, it was a fish. But not any fish you could picture in your head, a fish called kun, so vast that its size is literally unknowable. The text says kun is I don't know how many thousand li across. It doesn't even try to give you a measurement. The fish is beyond scale. And then kun transforms. The fish becomes a bird called Peng, whose wings span thousands of li, and when Peng takes flight, it rides a whirlwind 90,000 li into the sky to begin its migration south. The wind beneath its wings churns like an upside-down ocean. The bird doesn't glide gracefully, it launches with a violence of scale that's hard to even visualize, something the size of a continent lifting off. That image alone is one of the strangest openings in all of world literature, but the real philosophical point comes after. Down on the ground far below, a cicada and a small dove are sitting on a tree branch, watching Peng disappear into the upper atmosphere. And they laugh, they think it's ridiculous. Why would anything need to fly that high? The dove hops from tree to tree, that's plenty. That's the whole world. The cicada buzzes from branch to branch, what more do you need? They literally cannot imagine a reason for flying higher than the treetops. And here's where most people make the mistake. They assume Zhuangzi is siding with the Peng bird against the insects, that big is better. That the fish-sterned bird has achieved something the cicada is too small to understand. But that's not the point. The point is about the nature of perspective itself. Small minds literally cannot comprehend large ones. The cicada has no frame of reference for 90,000 li, so the idea doesn't even register as meaningful. But the reverse is equally true. The Peng bird, soaring at impossible altitudes, has absolutely no idea what it's like to be a cicada clinging to a twig in a warm breeze, and that experience is just as complete from the inside. Each creature lives within the limits of its own perspective, and the crucial thing is that the limits are invisible from within. The edges of your world don't look like edges, they look like the world. The chapter containing this story is called Free and Easy Wandering, Zaiyu, and the title names something that sounds effortless but is actually the most difficult thing Zhuangzi ever described. Freedom, in his telling, isn't the power to get what you want. It isn't wealth or status or the ability to bend the world to your will. Freedom is the absence of wanting anything in particular. Moving through the world without fixed purpose or destination, depending on nothing outside yourself for satisfaction. The text compares it to riding the wind, not steering it, not controlling it, not even knowing where it's going. Just being carried and being genuinely fine with that. It's a strange kind of freedom. Most philosophies and most self-help books, for that matter, tell you that freedom comes from getting stronger, getting smarter, getting better at controlling your circumstances. Zhuangzi says the opposite. Freedom comes from releasing the need for any of that, not grasping harder but opening the hand, not adding more to yourself but subtracting until what's left is so light the wind can carry it. There's something quietly radical about that, because it means the freest person in the room isn't the most powerful one. It's the one who needs the least, the one with nothing to defend and nowhere to be. And then after that cosmic opening, after a fish the size of a dark sea becomes a bird the size of a clouded sky, Zhuangzi takes you somewhere completely different, somewhere small and physical and specific, into a kitchen, into the smell of blood and bone and the rhythmic sound of a blade working through flesh. There's a cook named Ding who has been butchering oxen for his lord for 19 years, and in all that time his knife has never needed sharpening. Other cooks go through a knife every month, they hack at the meat, they force the blade against bone and the edge gives out. Good cooks, the competent ones, need a new knife every year. But cook Ding, 19 years, same blade, still sharp enough to split a hair. His lord watches him work one day and is mesmerized. He asks, how is this possible? Ding's answer is one of the most quoted passages in the history of Chinese philosophy. He says he stopped using his eyes years ago. He doesn't cut by sight, he feels the ox. He senses the joints, the natural spaces between muscle and bone, the hollow gaps where tissue separates from tissue, and this is the key phrase, no resistance. His blade slips into those gaps like it's moving through empty air, and there's a rhythm to it, he says, a music. His movements follow patterns that sound like a dance, and when the blade rises and turns and pauses, it's not because Ding is thinking about where to cut next. It's because the ox itself is showing him the way. This is Wu Wei, effortless action, not doing nothing but doing without forcing. And Zhuangzi chose a butcher to demonstrate it, not a meditation master on a silk cushion, not a hermit sitting quietly in a cave, but a man covered in sweat and blood, elbow deep in an ox carcass, who has found such complete harmony with his work that it sounds like music and his knife never dulls. Mastery isn't about overpowering the obstacles in front of you. It's about finding the gaps where there's no resistance and moving through them so naturally it doesn't even feel like effort. The distance between the Peng bird and cooked Ding is enormous. One spans the sky, the other stands in a kitchen. But Zhuangzi is showing you the same principle operating at completely different scales. The bird surrenders to the wind, the cook surrenders to the spaces in the ox. At both altitudes, the logic is identical. Freedom isn't something you seize, it's something you stop blocking. The wind was always there. The gaps in the ox were always there. The only thing that needed to change was your willingness to stop forcing and start failing. And there's something beautiful about placing the butcher right after the cosmic bird. It's as if Zhuangzi is saying, you don't need to fly 90,000 li to find this. You can find it in a kitchen. You can find it in the smallest, most ordinary work if you do that work with enough attention and enough surrender. Zhuangzi made these ideas feel effortless, like they arrived without struggle, like they'd always been obvious and he was just the first to say them out loud, but he didn't think them alone. He had someone, a specific, brilliant, difficult person who pushed back on everything, who questioned every claim, tested every parable, refused to let a single idea pass without holding it up and examining it from angles Zhuangzi hadn't considered. And losing that person broke something in him that all his elegant philosophy about detachment and the naturalness of transformation couldn't repair. His name was Huishi. People mostly call him Huizi. He was a logician, a member of a group called the School of Names, which was a cluster of thinkers in ancient China obsessed with paradoxes and the treacherous edges of language. They loved proving that words could be made to collapse under their own weight. Huizi was brilliant at this. He loved categories. He loved definitions. He loved taking an apparently solid concept, a horse, a color, a direction, and showing that it leaked. That the boundaries were conventions, not truths. He and Zhuangzi disagreed about nearly everything. Huizi believed in the power of careful logical analysis to get at the truth. Zhuangzi thought careful logical analysis was itself a kind of cage, a very sophisticated, very well-constructed cage, but a cage nonetheless. Huizi built arguments like bridges, sturdy and load-bearing. Zhuangzi dissolved them like sugar in water. They approached the same questions from opposite directions and spent their lives failing to convince each other. And this friction, this irresolvable disagreement, this perpetual mutual failure, was the basis of the deepest friendship in ancient Chinese philosophy. There's a moment in the Zhuangzi that might be the most nakedly human passage in the entire text. Sometime after Huizi died, Zhuangzi was walking past his old friend's grave with some companions, and he stopped, and he told them a story. There was once a man who got a tiny fleck of plaster on the tip of his nose, a speck no bigger than a fly's wing. He called in an expert stonecutter and asked him to remove it. The stonecutter swung his axe so fast it made a whistling sound, cut the plaster clean off, and left the man's nose completely untouched, not a scratch. A lord heard about this extraordinary skill and summoned the stonecutter. "Do it again," the lord commanded. "Show me." But the stonecutter shook his head. He said, "I used to be able to do that, but the man who would hold still for me, the one who trusted me enough not to flinch, he's dead. I can't do it without him. And then Zhuangzi said the thing that, for a philosopher who spent his entire life preaching non-attachment and the impermanence of all things, is almost unbearably raw. Since Huizi died, I have no material to work with. I have no one to talk to. The man who sang at his own wife's funeral. The man who told grieving friends that death was just another transformation. This same person stood at his friend's grave and said, "Something is gone now that can't come back," not Huizi's ideas, those survived in other texts, not his logical puzzles or his paradoxes. What was gone was the specific, irreplaceable friction of that particular mind against his own. Like the stonecutter's skill, the ability was real, but it needed a partner. Without someone who would hold still for the axe, the skill had nowhere to land. The most famous of their arguments happened on a bridge over the Hao River. They were standing together, leaning on the railing, looking down at the water, and Zhuangzi made an offhand observation. "Look at the minnows darting about free and easy. That's how fish are happy." Huizi pounced. "That was what he did. You're not a fish. How could you know whether fish are happy?" Zhuangzi turned it. "You're not me. How do you know I don't know?" It sounds like a quick comeback, the kind of thing you'd think of 3 hours later in the shower, but it's actually a philosophical trapdoor, because Huizi could respond, "Right, I'm not you, but by that same logic you're not the fish, so we're both trapped." And Zhuangzi could say, "But you're claiming to know something about what I can and can't know, which means you're making the same leap you're accusing me of." And the regress goes on forever. There's no bottom to stand on. The happy fish debate isn't about fish, not really. It's about whether any person can ever know what's happening inside another person's experience, whether your joy and my joy are the same kind of thing, or whether we're permanently sealed inside our own heads, guessing at each other's inner lives through words and expressions that might mean something completely different to each of us. And the answer the debate gestures toward is, maybe we can't know for certain. But the reaching, the attempt to bridge that gap, the willingness to look at minnows and say they're happy, even though you'll never prove it, might be the most deeply human thing we do. And here's where the butterfly dream comes back, but not the version everyone knows. A stranger, deeper version that most readers miss even if they've picked up the Zhuangzi. In Chapter 2, a character named Chang Wuzi tells Quezi something that extends the butterfly dream's doubt from identity into even more unsettling territory. Quezi asks, can anyone truly know what's right, what's real, what's true? And Chang Wuzi's answer isn't no. It's worse than no. He says, even if I could give you the correct answer, how would either of us know whether that answer came from a waking mind or a dreaming one? Even the act of knowing, the moment when you feel certain about something, might itself be happening inside a dream. So the doubt doesn't just dissolve who you are. It dissolves whether knowing is something you can do at all. Every piece of knowledge you've ever felt sure about might be a butterfly that hasn't woken up yet. The ground floor of certainty turns out to have a basement, and the basement has a basement. The butterfly dream started as a riddle about identity. It asked, who are you really? Now through this extension it's become something larger and more unsettling, a riddle about the nature of knowing itself. Can you know anything at all? And if the knowing itself might be happening inside a dream, if even your certainty might be dreaming, then what ground is left to stand on? What floor is underneath the floor? Zhuangzi's response, and calling it a response, already makes it sound more structured than it isn't to solve the riddle. He doesn't offer a better epistemology. He doesn't build a more rigorous method for determining what's real and what's dreamed. He says, with what feels like a shrug, stop trying, let it go, empty the hands. If you can't know which side of the dream you're on, maybe the question isn't worth gripping so tightly. But if you cannot know another mind, and cannot even know whether your own knowing is part of a dream, what is left? Zhuangzi's answer was quiet and radical at the same time. Stop trying to know. Empty the cup. He had a phrase for it, Xinzhai, fasting of the mind. And the image is exactly what it sounds like. You know what it feels like to fast, to empty your stomach, to let the hunger pass through you until your body settles into a different kind of quiet. Zhuangzi said you could do the same thing with your thoughts, not forget what you know, not become ignorant. But clear out the habits, the compulsive judging, the automatic picking of sides, the way your mind sorts every single experience into good or bad or right or wrong before you've even finished having the experience. Empty the mind the way you'd empty a stomach. Let the opinions drain out and the need to be correct and the reflexive certainty that you know how things should be. What's left when that drains away isn't blankness, it's availability, it's openness. Remember the hollow spaces in the cliff where the wind makes music. The mind becomes one of those hollows, a space that doesn't generate sound of its own but responds to whatever breath passes through it. The text calls this the hinge of the Tao, a pivot point that turns freely in any direction because nothing is jammed against it, no fixed opinion blocking the rotation. No, I'm right and you're wrong, wedged into the mechanism. Just a capacity to swing wherever things need to go. And there's a scene in chapter 6 that takes this further, maybe the most subversive passage in all of Confucian literature, which is impressive because it was written by someone who wasn't a Confucian at all. Confucius, yes, that Confucius, or at least the character Zhuangzi playfully calls Confucius, is sitting with his favorite student, Yan Hui. And Yan Hui tells the master he has learned something new, something he calls sitting and forgetting. Zhuang. Confucius asks what that means. And Yan Hui describes it. I let go of my limbs, I dismiss hearing and sight, I leave my body behind, I abandon knowledge, and I become one with the great openness. The scene is structured as a bomb disguised as a meditation lesson. Because in any Confucian text, any proper orthodox Confucian text, the teacher teaches and the student learns. That's the hierarchy, that's the bedrock, respect for elders, for tradition, for the downward transmission of wisdom. But in this passage, the student is teaching the master. Yan Hui has traveled somewhere Confucius hasn't been, and Confucius doesn't argue or correct him. He says, essentially, let me follow you. Teach me what you've learned. The great teacher becomes the student of his own student, and what the student teaches is how to forget everything the teacher spent a lifetime trying to transmit. Zhuangzi is being playful here, he's also being devastating. He's saying the greatest Confucian virtue, the patient accumulation of knowledge and wisdom, only carries you so far. At some point you have to let go of what you've accumulated. The student who can release what he was taught has reached a place the teacher can't follow. Not because the teacher failed, but because teaching itself has a ceiling. Above that ceiling, the only way up is to stop climbing. And then there's the tree. In chapter 4, there's a massive, ancient tree, so gnarled, so knotted, so twisted in every possible direction that no carpenter who passes it would give it a second glance. You couldn't make a table from its wood. You couldn't cut a straight beam from it. The grain spirals every which way. The trunk is hollowed in places. For a woodworker, it's not even disappointing, it's invisible, worthless. And the tree appears to one of these carpenters in a dream. It says something that changes the rest of the passage. My uselessness is exactly what saved my life. Look at the fruit trees, they bear beautiful fruit, and every year people come and tear their branches apart to get at it. The great limbs crack, the small ones get stripped bare, their usefulness destroys them. Look at the timber trees, tall and straight and strong, and they get chopped down in their prime because someone needs a roof beam. Everything that is useful gets consumed by the very quality that makes it valuable. But me, nobody wants me, nobody has ever wanted me, no one has come to my roots with an axe, and so I've been standing here for hundreds of years, growing larger and wilder and more tangled and more fully alive than anything else in this forest. My uselessness is my protection. There's something quietly devastating about that parable, and something almost too relevant, isn't there? The things that last aren't always the things that perform. The organisms that endure aren't always the ones that hustle hardest or produce the most or make themselves indispensable. Sometimes the most enduring things in the world are the ones nobody ever wanted anything from. They just stood there, growing, in no particular direction. Getting more gnarled and more strange and more completely themselves with every passing year, and nobody bothered them because nobody saw anything worth taking. Zhuangzi isn't saying usefulness is bad. He's saying that usefulness is dangerous, that the world has a way of consuming the things it values. And the tree, dreaming in its own hollow trunk, has outlived every straight-grained timber tree in the forest. There's a thread connecting all three of these images: the fasted mind, the forgotten body, the useless tree. In each case, what the world considers weakness turns out to be the source of durability. The empty mind is more responsive than the full one. The student who forgets outgrows the teacher who remembers. The tree that no one wants outlasts every tree that was valued. Weakness, emptiness, uselessness, these are not failures in the Zhuangzi. They're strategies. Not aggressive ones, not deliberate ones, but strategies. The way water's softness is a strategy. It doesn't try to be powerful, and it wears down stone. This whole stretch sits at the midpoint of the story we've been following, and it's the hinge. Everything before this was accumulation: the dream, the man, the book, the parables, the friendship. Everything after this will be about what happens when you release what you've gathered. When you stop holding on to knowledge, to identity, to language, to the difference between being alive and not being alive. The cup is empty now. Let's see what pours in. Emptying the mind is one kind of letting go, but Zhuangzi pushed further than emptiness of thought. He asked what happens when you empty everything, including the difference between being alive and being dead. When Zhuangzi's wife died, his friend Huizi came to the house to mourn, and what he found when he arrived has been shocking readers for over 2,000 years. Zhuangzi was sitting on the ground with his legs splayed out in front of him, pounding on the bottom of a tub and singing. Huizi was horrified. "This woman lived with you," he said. "She raised your children. She grew old beside you. Not mourning her, fine, maybe I could accept that. But sitting there pounding on a tub and singing, how is this not monstrous?" Zhuangzi's answer is one of the strangest and most tender passages in ancient philosophy. He said, "When she first died, do you think I didn't grieve? Of course I did, how could I not? But then I looked back beyond the beginning, before she had a body, before she had spirit, before she had breath. In the very beginning, in the blur and chaos before things took shape, there was just formlessness. And then something shifted in the formlessness and breath appeared. The breath shifted and form appeared. The form shifted and life appeared, and now life has shifted again and she's dead. It's the same as the turning of the four seasons: spring, summer, fall, winter. She's resting now in the great chamber of the cosmos. And for me to go around howling and weeping would mean I don't understand the way things change, so I stopped." Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say he didn't grieve. He says he did. The grief came first. It was real and it hit him the way grief hits everyone. What followed wasn't the absence of feeling, wasn't cold detachment or philosophical numbness. It was a kind of recognition. Grief is a form of insistence that things should remain as they were. And the one thing Zhuangzi understood more deeply than almost any thinker in history is that things don't remain. They turn. The seasons don't stop. The transformations don't pause for your preferences. His wife had changed form, that's all. She hadn't vanished. She'd become something else, like water becoming ice, becoming vapor. The substance was the same, only the shape had changed. And then there's a darker passage, stranger, more eerie. Zhuangzi is on the road to the state of Chu when he finds a skull lying in the dust by the roadside, a human skull, empty-eyed, half-buried. He pokes it with his riding crop. He talks to it, which is already odd behavior. He asks, "How did you end up here? War, execution, starvation? Did you freeze in a bad winter? Were you just old?" The skull, obviously, says nothing. But Zhuangzi doesn't seem troubled by the silence. He tucks the skull under his head, using it as a pillow, and falls asleep. And in his dream, the skull visits him. It has a face again, and it speaks, and what it says is remarkable. Death is better than life. In death, the skull tells him there are no kings above you giving orders, no servants below demanding your time, no brutal winters or baking summers to endure. The dead have the wholeness of heaven and earth for their spring and autumn. No ruler on earth, the skull says, has joy to equal this. Zhuangzi, being Zhuangzi, pushes back. He offers to restore the skull to life, to bring it a body, a family, a home, a place in the world. The skull's face goes dark. It says, Why would I throw away the happiness of a dead person to go back to the toil of the living? There it is again, the butterfly dream turned inside out. If you can't know whether you're dreaming or awake, then you can't know whether living or dying is the better state. The skull isn't making a philosophical argument. It's reporting from the other side with the calm authority of someone who's already been through the door and found it was just fine, better than fine, quiet. And maybe that's the peace the dreamer in the butterfly dream never found, not by solving the riddle, but by arriving at a place where riddles don't apply anymore, where there's nothing left to figure out and no one left doing the figuring. The skull didn't become wise. It became something simpler than that. It became someone who didn't need to know anymore. And then there's Master Lai. He's dying, his body is twisting, his back curving, his organs pressing against each other as the structure fails. His chin is sinking toward his navel, and his friend comes to him and asks, "Do you resent this? Are you angry at what's happening to your body?" Master Lai says no. He offers an image that is, for all its simplicity, one of the most quietly stunning things in the Zhuangzi. He says, "The great clod burdens me with form, labors me with life, eases me in old age, and rests me in death." The great clod, that's his name for the cosmos, the earth, the force that assembles things and disassembles them. He compares the yin and yang to parents, specifically to a father giving commands. If your father tells you to go east or west, north or south, you go. And if the cosmos tells you to die, refusing would make you worse than a disobedient child. It would make you someone who doesn't understand where they are, a guest who refuses to leave when the party is over. Death in this telling isn't an enemy to be fought or a tragedy to be mourned. It's the next room. The great clod is just sending you somewhere else, somewhere you haven't been yet. There's a pattern here if you trace it across these three stories. Zhuangzi's wife transforms from form back to formlessness, and he finds peace in recognizing the pattern. The skull transforms from a living person to a dead one, and discovers it prefers the new arrangement. Master Lai is in the middle of the transformation right now, his body visibly failing, and he calls it rest. In each case, the peace comes not from understanding death intellectually, not from having the right philosophical framework, but from something simpler, stopping the resistance, going with the turn instead of bracing against it. And notice something else. In all three stories, the person who's dying or dead is at peace. It's the living who struggle. Huizi is horrified by the singing. Zhuangzi is the one who has to explain. The friend asks Master Lai if he resents what's happening to him. The dead don't have this problem. It's only the alive who insist that death should be terrible. If you're lying in the dark right now, if your body has settled into the mattress and your breathing has begun to slow and the thoughts are starting to soften around their edges, there's something to sit with in that framing. Zhuangzi didn't make death sound heroic. He didn't make it dramatic or noble or tragic. He made it sound like what your body is already doing. Easing, resting, going quiet, like the great clod sending you gently into the next room. If Zhuangzi was right, if death is rest, and the boundary between dreaming and waking was never solid to begin with, then what kind of person would you become if you truly absorbed that, not as an idea, but as a way of inhabiting every moment? The Zhuangzi has an answer. It describes someone called the true person, Zhenren, and the description reads like nothing else in ancient Chinese philosophy. It's not a list of virtues to cultivate or rules to follow. It's a portrait, and it's strange. The true person did not love life or hate death, did not rejoice in being born or resist returning. No preference between the two states, no clinging to one, no fear of the other. But then the details get stranger. The true person slept without dreaming, which is an odd detail in a text built around the most famous dream in philosophy, and breathed from the heels. Not shallow chest breathing, not even deep belly breathing, but something that seemed to originate from the very bottom of the body, as if the entire person were just one long, open channel for breath to move through. From the soles of the feet to the crown of the head, one unbroken passage. Nothing blocked, nothing constricted. The true person accepted both defeat and victory without being moved by either, Not through gritted teeth endurance, not I can take it. More like a lake after a stone has been thrown into it. The ripples happen, they spread and diminish, and the lake returns to being the lake. Nothing was added, nothing was lost. It's a portrait of someone not powerful or brilliant or impressive in the ways we usually recognize. Just someone so completely at ease with the fact that everything changes that there's nothing left in them to grip or defend. The boundary between self and world has dissolved, not violently, not like a wall being knocked down, but gently, like fog thinning on a warm morning until you realize you can see straight through where it used to be. Now here's something most people don't expect when they read about Zhuangzi. The singing at the funeral, that story about pounding on a tub when his wife died, it didn't stay locked inside philosophy books for scholars to argue about. It seeped out. It became a real, living practice. In the Chinese provinces of Hubei and Hunan, a folk tradition called funeral drumming, sangu, developed over the centuries. When someone died, the family and neighbors wouldn't just weep. They'd drum, they'd sing, not hymns or requiems, rhythmic, communal, full-bodied sound that filled the room where the body lay. The drumming wasn't a denial of grief, it was a container for it, a way of holding the sorrow inside something bigger, something shared, something that had a beat you could breathe along with. This tradition lasted well into the 1700s and 1800s. Centuries after the Zhuangzi was written, people who had almost certainly never read it, farmers, villagers, people who'd never seen a philosophical text in their lives, were drumming at deathbeds because the idea had worked its way so deeply into the culture that it stopped being an idea at all. It became something people simply did, something their grandparents had done. Something that felt right even if nobody could trace it back to a philosopher who sat on the ground pounding a tub after his wife transformed into whatever comes next. There's something genuinely moving about that, about an idea escaping the text that made it and burrowing so deep into how people live that they forget it was ever an idea at all. It became breath, it became rhythm, it became the sound of drums at a funeral, which is maybe the most alive sound a dead person ever caused. And then there's the paradox sitting at the center of Zhuangzi's physical legacy, and it is genuinely one of the funniest things in the history of ideas. Chapter 15 of the Zhuangzi contains the earliest known reference to something called Dao Yin, guiding and pulling exercises. These are physical practices, imitating the way a bear stretches its limbs when it wakes, the way a bird extends its wings before flight. They're exercises for cultivating health, flexibility, longevity, for taking care of the body with attention and patience. And this same text, written by a philosopher who questioned whether bodies were real, who compared life to a dream and death to a well-earned rest, who suggested the very idea of a stable self might be the cosmos playing a temporary joke on itself. This text is the oldest surviving source for the practices that eventually branched into Tai Chi and Qigong. 2,000 years of human beings doing slow, precise movements in parks at dawn, training their bodies with extraordinary care and devotion. And the entire tradition traces back to a man who wasn't entirely sure bodies existed. The philosopher who said, "Maybe I'm a butterfly," is also the man who taught China to stretch like a bear. He would have loved that. It's exactly the kind of contradiction that the Zhuangzi insists is not actually a contradiction at all, just two shapes the same breath passes through. And maybe there's something to it. Maybe questioning the reality of the body doesn't prevent you from taking care of it. Maybe it even helps. If you stop gripping the body, stop treating it as the most important thing, the thing you have to protect at all costs, maybe you actually move better, lighter, with less resistance in the joints. Cook Ding didn't grip his knife. The true person breath from the heels. And somewhere in a park in Shanghai right now, an 80-year-old woman is doing Tai Chi at dawn, her movements so smooth they look like water flowing, and she's probably never read a word of the Zhuangzi. But the butterfly is in her hands anyway. But here is the paradox Zhuangzi himself could never escape. Everything he taught, every parable, every argument, every playful subversion of someone else's certainty was about going beyond words. getting past language to something that language can't hold, and he had to use words to say all of it. Every sentence in the Zhuangzi is a finger pointing at the moon, and the finger, stubborn, unavoidable, made of language, keeps getting in the way of the view. He couldn't gesture at the wordless without words. He couldn't escape the trap while using it as his only tool. There's a passage in chapter 26 that confronts this problem more directly than anywhere else in the text. Zhuangzi writes, "The fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've caught the fish, you can forget the trap. The snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've caught the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words." It sounds clean, almost elegantly resolved. The words are tools, and once the tool has done its job, you set it down. But then he adds a coda, a quiet, almost wistful final line that changes the tone of the entire passage. "Where can I find a person who has forgotten words so I can have a word with them?" Read that again slowly. He wants to find someone who has moved past language, someone who has caught the fish and discarded the trap. And his method of finding them is language. He wants to have a conversation with someone who no longer needs conversations. The paradox isn't an accident. It isn't a mistake he didn't notice. It's the whole point. And the sadness in that final line, that quiet, "Where can I find?" isn't a philosopher being clever. It's a man standing at the edge of what his tools can reach, looking across at something he can sense but can't touch. And the only bridge available to him is made from the exact material he's trying to transcend. That's a special kind of loneliness, the loneliness of someone who knows exactly what they want to say and also knows that saying it will always fall short. Not because the words are bad, but because words are words, and what he's pointing at is the space where words run out. And yet he kept writing. That's the part that gets me. He didn't stop. He didn't throw down the brush and say, "What's the point?" He wrote parables and dialogues and absurd stories and goblet words that tipped over and spilled, and he kept going book after book, chapter after chapter, knowing that every sentence was both a bridge and an obstacle. As if the attempt itself, the reaching, the failing, the reaching again, was the closest he could get to the thing he couldn't name. The fish trap, lovingly maintained, even after you know you'll never quite catch the fish. Now people have often compared Zhuangzi to the Western philosopher who came closest to asking the same question. In 1641, roughly 2,000 years after the butterfly dream, René Descartes published his dream argument. The idea, since dreams can feel completely real while you're inside them, you can never be totally certain that what you're experiencing right now isn't a dream. It's one of the most famous thought experiments in Western intellectual history. And at first glance, it looks like Descartes and Zhuangzi arrived at the same destination from opposite ends of the world. But look more carefully and the gap between them widens, because Descartes had an escape hatch. His answer was cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Even if absolutely everything is a dream, the body, the world, the people around you, the room you're sitting in, the fact that there is something doing the doubting proves at least one thing exists. There must be an I, the thinker is real, even if the thought is illusion. Descartes grabbed onto that I like a drowning man grabbing a rope, and he pulled himself out of the dream. Zhuangzi does not have that exit. In fact, the butterfly dream is specifically designed to seal it shut, because the whole point of the parable is that the I is exactly what you can't trust. The man was certain he was a man. The butterfly was certain it was a butterfly. Both felt equally real from inside the experience. So the self that Descartes uses to anchor all certainty, the cogito, the irreducible I think, is the very thing Zhuangzi dissolves. You can't build a foundation on the one element that keeps changing shape. That's like trying to stand on running water and calling it solid ground. The scholarly response to this comparison has been fascinating in its own right. Lisa Raffles and Paul Kjellberg, both Western philosophers working in comparative traditions, have argued that Zhuangzi shares deep affinities with the ancient Greek skeptics Pyrrho and Sextus Empiricus, both of whom counseled suspending judgment about what is ultimately real and finding a kind of peace in that suspension. Stop trying to decide. Stop arguing about the nature of the universe. Just suspend the question and tranquility follows. But then Hans-Georg Moeller proposed something more destabilizing. He argues that Zhuangzi isn't a skeptic at all, not even a philosopher in the usual sense. He's a satirist. The parables aren't genuine philosophical arguments. They're elaborate, brilliantly constructed jokes designed to make every philosophical position, including skepticism itself, look absurd. The moment you try to take Zhuangzi seriously, you've already fallen for it. The moment you pin him to a stance, the stance tips over, like a goblet word spilling its wine. And that reading, the satirist reading, has a strange ring of truth to it, because every time you think you've identified what Zhuangzi is doing, every time you reach for a label that makes sense, the identification dissolves in your hand. He won't be pinned. He won't hold a position long enough for you to mount an objection. You can't argue with someone who isn't standing anywhere. And isn't that what the transformation of things has been telling us all along? Nothing stays in one shape, not identity, not knowledge, not even the philosopher describing the principle. The butterfly becomes the man becomes the philosopher becomes, what? A satirist, a mystic, a thinker so committed to transformation that he won't even let his own meaning solidify. Maybe the fish trap was never meant to catch anything. Maybe it was always just a gesture, a hand extended toward water, knowing the fish will swim away, making the gesture anyway because the reaching is its own kind of meaning. Zhuangzi asked whether you could know if you were dreaming. 24 centuries later, neuroscience found the part of the brain that normally prevents you from asking. It's called the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral region, the part that handles self-reflection, metacognition, the kind of thinking where you step back from your own experience and evaluate it. The inner voice that says, hold on, this doesn't add up. During ordinary REM sleep, normal dreaming, this region goes significantly quiet, not completely dark, but deeply dimmed, like a guard post with the lights turned low. And that dimming is why dreams feel real. It's why you don't question the talking dog in the kitchen, or the house that has 17 staircases and none of them go anywhere, or the fact that you're somehow back in a school you left decades ago. The part of the brain that would normally catch those absurdities and raise a flag, the part that says this is impossible, you must be dreaming, is barely functioning. It's not that dreams are masterful illusions that actively fool you. It's simpler than that. The detector is sleeping. The critical faculty has clocked out for the night. There are exceptions. Lucid dreamers, people who become aware they are dreaming mid-dream while the dream continues around them, show a reactivation of the prefrontal cortex during REM sleep. The guard wakes up. The lights in the guard post turn back on. And something remarkable, brain scans of frequent lucid dreamers reveal they have measurably more gray matter in the frontopolar cortex than people who rarely or never experience lucid dreams. The hardware is literally, physically different. The people who can routinely ask, am I dreaming, inside a dream have more of the neural tissue that makes the question possible. So Zhuangzi's question, how do you know you're not dreaming right now, targets with uncanny precision the exact neural mechanism that normally prevents us from asking it during sleep. He didn't know about the prefrontal cortex. He couldn't have known. He lived 24 centuries before neuroimaging existed, but he identified the blind spot. He found the gap in the guard's patrol and he poked right at it. And the lucid dreaming research adds a strange footnote to the true person description from a few chapters back. Remember, the true person slept without dreaming, no dreams at all, which could mean the true person has dissolved the boundary between dreaming and waking so completely that neither state registers as different from the other. Not dreamless sleep in the ordinary sense, but a consciousness so even, so free of the usual fluctuations, that the distinction between dream and waking simply doesn't apply. And it goes deeper than the prefrontal cortex. There are threshold states that sit right at the border. Zhuangzi was probing the boundary between sleep and waking, where neither word quite applies. Sleep researchers call the falling asleep version hypnagogia. It's that twilight zone when you're drifting off. Thoughts start to wander in odd directions. Images float up from somewhere beneath conscious control, a face, a color, a fragment of a sentence. And the strangest part is you often don't notice the transition happening. You feel awake, you might be forming what seem like perfectly coherent thoughts, but if someone shook your shoulder and asked you to repeat what you'd been thinking, you couldn't. The thoughts were dissolving even as you had them. You were falling asleep and calling it wakefulness. The reverse hypnopompia, the state of waking from sleep, is even more unsettling. People in this state can be physically paralyzed, seeing vivid figures in their rooms, hearing voices or footsteps, and genuinely believing they are awake and perceiving reality. The brain cannot, in that moment, reliably answer the question, "Am I dreaming?" not because the question is too philosophical, but because the machinery that answers it, the prefrontal cortex, the metacognitive circuitry, hasn't finished rebooting. The system is half on, half off, and half on turns out to be worse than fully off because you have confidence in perceptions that are being generated entirely from the inside. And then there's the framework that makes all of this even stranger. Neuroscientist Anil Seth and philosopher Andy Clark have described ordinary waking perception, the normal, everyday experience of seeing the world and hearing sounds and navigating your kitchen, as a controlled hallucination. The brain doesn't passively receive the world like a camera. It actively generates a model, a prediction, a best-guess simulation of what it expects to be out there. And then it checks that prediction against incoming sensory data. When data and prediction match, you experience reality. When they don't, when something unexpected happens, you get a correction, a surprise, a flicker of confusion, followed by an updated prediction. But here's the key word: controlled. The hallucination is running constantly. Every waking moment, your brain is generating an internal simulation of the world, and then checking it against the information coming in from your eyes, your ears, your skin. What you call reality is the version of the hallucination that happens to match the incoming data well enough to keep you alive and functional. And during sleep, when the incoming sensory data dries up, when the eyes close and the room goes dark and the muscles go slack, the hallucination keeps running. Unchecked, unmoored, that's what a dream is. The same prediction engine, spinning freely without the error correction signal from outside. Which means Zhuangzi's doubt, the insistence that you can't know whether waking life is more real than dreaming, isn't mysticism. It isn't poetry or metaphor or philosophical provocation for its own sake. It's a description of how perception actually works. The dream and waking reality are running the same software. The only difference is the amount of correction flowing in from outside. Turn the correction signal down and reality loosens into a dream. Turn it off entirely and you're sleeping. It's a dial, not a switch. If you're listening to this in the dark right now, lying somewhere between waking and sleep, your body growing heavy, your thoughts starting to drift, your brain is doing what Zhuangzi described 24 centuries ago. The borders are softening. The hallucination is loosening its leash, and you may not be able to tell at this exact moment which side of the threshold you're on. 24 centuries ago, a man in a small, despised country described the precise vulnerability that makes your consciousness unreliable, and he did it without knowing a single thing about the organ that produces it. He just noticed the gap. He noticed that certainty feels the same from inside whether it's justified or not, and he turned that observation into 90 words that neuroscience is still, in its own vocabulary, trying to explain. The guard is getting drowsy, the gate is swinging open. Zhuangzi was not the only person in history to wonder whether dreams might be more real than waking life. On the other side of the world, entirely different answers took root in soil he never knew existed. In Australia, among Aboriginal peoples, there is a concept that Western anthropologists once translated, quite badly, as dream time. The word in the Arandic language is closer to Alcharinga, and it doesn't mean what most English speakers assume when they hear it. It doesn't refer to something that happened long ago, the way a creation myth describes events in the distant past, and it doesn't mean the time when people dream in the ordinary sense of sleeping. Alturinga points at something closer to eternal, uncreated, an ever-present layer of reality in which ancestral beings continue to shape the physical landscape of the world. Not shaped, continue to shape, present tense, right now, not back then. In this framework, dreaming isn't a sleep state, it's an ontological category, a way of saying that beneath the visible world of rocks and rivers and sun and dust, there runs something more fundamental, more real, not less. The ancestors who sang the land into its current form are still singing. The songlines that map the continent invisible paths of creation connecting sacred sites across thousands of miles of desert and forest are still active, still resonant, still doing their work. And dreaming, in the sense of accessing that deeper layer, is the closest a living person can get to the bedrock of what truly exists. And this is almost the exact opposite of Zhuangzi's open question. Zhuangzi says, I cannot tell which side of the dream is more real. Aboriginal philosophy says, the dream side is more real. The ordinary experience you walk through every day, the tangible, the measurable, the sunlit, that's the lesser thing. The dream is the foundation. Same question, same starting point, is the dream real, and radically different answers. Zhuangzi finds freedom in the impossibility of choosing. He's playful about it. He treats the uncertainty as an opening, a doorway into a lighter way of being. Aboriginal philosophy finds grounding in the certainty that the dream side is where reality lives. It's not playful at all, it's sacred. The dreaming isn't an intellectual puzzle, it's the ground you stand on. Your relationship to country, to ancestors, to everything that made the world what it is. And neither answer sounds unreasonable, which may be the most arresting part. You can sit with both of them. You can feel the pull of both, which is, in a way, exactly what the butterfly dream predicts. Two perfectly valid perspectives, and no master perspective from which to judge between them. In a completely different century and tradition, Edgar Allan Poe arrived at the same crossroads, but from the direction of grief. His 1849 poem, A Dream Within a Dream, closes with the lines most people know. All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. He's on a shore watching grains of sand slip through his fingers one by one, and asking not as an intellectual exercise, not as philosophy, but as a cry, whether anything he has ever held was real. Whether anything stayed. And his conclusion is identical to Zhuangzi's. You cannot prove you're awake. The ground beneath your feet might not be ground at all. The feeling, the emotional temperature of the idea could not be more different. Where Zhuangzi treats this uncertainty as a kind of liberation, a reason to release your grip on fixed identities and let yourself become something new, Poe treats it as devastation. The sand is slipping, the dream is fading, and there is nothing he can do to hold on. Same metaphysical doubt, same conclusion. But in one thinker it becomes freedom, and in the other it becomes anguish. The difference isn't in the logic. It's in the emotional soil the logic grows in. Plant the same seed in different ground, and you get an entirely different plant. Zhuangzi's soil was Taoist, a tradition that already valued letting go, that saw attachment as the root of suffering. Poe's soil was romantic, a tradition that valued intensity of feeling, that saw loss as proof of love. Same rain, different gardens, and different flowers. And then there is Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine writer who spent his entire literary life constructing labyrinths out of dream and mirror and time, encountered the butterfly dream and called it, flatly, without hedging, the finest metaphor of all. He said it during his 1967 Norton lectures at Harvard, and he wasn't being generous or polite, he meant it. He praised the choice of the butterfly specifically, not a tiger, not an eagle, not some fierce and definite animal, but a butterfly. Something fragile and flickering and impossible to pin down without destroying it. Borges wove the parable into his own work, most notably his essay, A New Refutation of Time, which argues with deadpan seriousness that might itself be an elaborate joke, that time is an illusion. That sequence is a dream, that what we experience as before and after might be no more solid than the difference between being a man and being a butterfly. If identity can dissolve between dreaming and waking, Borges asked, why can't time dissolve between one moment and the next? The butterfly dream in his hands became a tool for questioning not just who you are, but when you are. And the lineage didn't stop with Borges. Scholars have traced a direct literary line from the Zhuangzi through Borges' labyrinths to the contemporary Chinese novelist Chan, whose dreamlike, disorienting fiction deliberately inhabits the space the butterfly dream creates, that threshold zone where categories dissolve and ordinary logic loses traction. Chan's characters wander through worlds that resist stable interpretation, where the reader, like Zhuangzi waking from the butterfly dream, can't quite be sure what's real and what's imagined. 190-word parable, 3 languages, 23 centuries, and the butterfly is still in flight, still landing on new flowers, still refusing to be pinned down, still doing what butterflies do, which is to say, being beautiful and unreliable and impossible to follow for very long. The butterfly dream traveled through cultures that never heard of the Zhuangzi, but it also reshaped the traditions closest to it, starting with one that arrived in China 3 centuries after Zhuangzi died and had to borrow his words to make itself understood. When Buddhism crossed into China in the 1st century CE, it faced a fundamental problem. The Sanskrit concepts that made Buddhism work, emptiness, impermanence, the dissolution of the self, the idea that suffering arises from clinging to things that never were solid, these didn't have ready-made Chinese translations. The words didn't exist, or rather they almost existed. There were Chinese terms that came close, that pointed in roughly the same direction. And the closest cluster of those terms came from the vocabulary Zhuangzi had invented 300 years before Buddhism reached the border. A monk named Zhao is one of the most important figures in the history of Chinese Buddhism. Before his conversion, he was a devoted student of the Zhuangzi. It was the text that shaped how he thought about reality, about language, about the limits of what can be known. And even after he encountered the Vimalakirti Sutra and committed himself to Buddhism, he couldn't or wouldn't stop thinking in Zhuangzi's idiom. His most influential works are a weave of Taoist imagery and Buddhist doctrine, braided so tightly that scholars still argue about which thread is which. The Zhuangzi's dissolution of fixed categories became the vehicle for Buddhism's teaching on emptiness. The fish trap became a way to talk about the limits of sutra. And this wasn't a footnote in the history of Asian religion, it was a tectonic shift. The tradition that grew from this mixing, Chan Buddhism, which the Japanese later called Zen, carries Zhuangzi's DNA in nearly everything it does. Chan's famous distrust of formal language, its insistence that sutras and written teachings can become obstacles rather than aids to awakening. That's the fish trap, catch the fish, throw the trap away, and if you're still holding the trap, you've missed the point. Its conviction that the way lives in ordinary activities, chopping wood, carrying water, sweeping the monastery courtyard, cooking a bowl of rice. That's Cook Ding with his knife, finding the spaces of no resistance in the most mundane labor. The koan tradition, those paradoxical riddles that Zen masters use to short-circuit a student's rational mind until something deeper wakes up. Those are goblet words. Filling and spilling, until the student stops trying to hold the wine and just lets it pour. There's a famous Chan story about a monk who asks his teacher, "What is the Buddha?" The teacher replies, 3 pounds of flax. That kind of answer, absurd on the surface, designed to break the question rather than answer it, could have come straight from the Zhuangzi. And in a real sense, it did. The lineage runs directly back through Zhao's blended vocabulary to Zhuangzi's own techniques of saying one thing and meaning something the words refuse to carry. Buddhism didn't merely borrow vocabulary from the Zhuangzi, it borrowed a sensibility, a stance toward language and meaning and the relationship between them. A willingness to use words against themselves, to build a teaching and then undercut it, and a deep trust that something important survives, might even emerge more clearly, when meaning spills over the edges of what words can hold. The fish trap in Chan Buddhist hands became a whole philosophy of instruction. Give the student a trap, and when the student clings to it, take it away. And here is the irony Zhuangzi himself would have savored, the kind of irony that feels like the cosmos playing a practical joke on intellectual history. The very tradition that tried hardest to bury his influence couldn't stop stealing from him. Zhuangzi was a 12th century Song dynasty thinker, a Neo-Confucian, generally ranked second only to Confucius himself in influence on Chinese intellectual history. His entire philosophical project was about restoring and strengthening Confucian orthodoxy against what he saw as the corrosive influence of Buddhism and Taoism. He wanted a system that was specifically, emphatically, unmistakably Confucian. And yet, when Zhuangzi needed an image for his ethical ideal, the way a truly virtuous person responds to circumstances with natural, unforced spontaneity, what he reached for was the cooked-ding parable. The butcher who moves his knife through the ox without resistance, effortless mastery. Wu Wei wearing a Confucian robe. He smuggled Zhuangzi's most characteristic concept into the beating heart of a rival tradition that had spent centuries trying to push Taoism to the margins. Nobody stopped him, or if anyone objected, the objection didn't survive. The cooked-ding parable was just too good, too vivid, too useful, too perfectly suited to what Zhuangzi was trying to express. And that's the Zhuangzi's secret weapon, really. The parables are so good that people can't resist using them even when they disagree with the philosophy behind them. The ideas travel inside the stories like seeds inside fruit. You eat the fruit because it tastes good. The seeds plant themselves without your permission. Zhuangzi's borrowing also reveals something about the nature of the Zhuangzi itself. It isn't a doctrine, it's a toolkit. A collection of images and stories so flexible and so deeply grounded in human experience that they can be picked up and used by anyone, Taoist, Buddhist, Confucian, or someone who's never heard of any of them. The parables work because they describe something real about how bodies move and minds think and tools disappear into skilled hands. You don't have to accept Zhuangzi's metaphysics to feel the truth of cooked-ding's knife. Which circles back to the question that's been hovering since the chapter on language. What was Zhuangzi actually? A skeptic, a mystic, a satirist, a genuine philosopher making genuine claims about the nature of reality. And the fact that Buddhism, Confucianism, Western analytic philosophy, and postmodern literary theory have all looked into the Zhuangzi and seen their own reflections staring back, that might be the answer. A thinker so fluid that every tradition finds what it needs in his words, and none of them can hold the water long enough to carry it home. Like a goblet word, like a butterfly that lands on every flower but belongs to none of them. Zhuangzi reshaped how people thought, but he also reshaped how they painted, how they wrote poetry, and 24 centuries later, how they made movies. For over 1,000 years, Chinese landscape painting was quietly built on foundations Zhuangzi laid. The literati painters, scholar artists who painted not for court commissions or market demand, but for spiritual cultivation and personal expression, drew directly on his ideals of spontaneity and spiritual freedom. The concept of carefree wandering from Chapter 1 became the animating energy of Shanshui painting, those mountain and water scrolls that seem to dissolve the distance between the viewer and the scene. The painter isn't depicting a mountain from a fixed vantage point, standing at an easel with a measured frame. The painter is wandering through the landscape, and the brushwork is the trail left behind by that wandering, each stroke a footprint of a mind moving freely through space. There's no single vanishing point, no correct place to stand. The scroll unrolls and you move through it the way you'd move through a forest, turning, pausing, looking up, looking down. The Zhuangzi didn't invent Chinese landscape painting, obviously. But it gave painters a philosophical reason to paint the way they wanted to, not as representation, but as experience, not a picture of nature, a participation in it. Calligraphers cited the Zhuangzi too, perhaps even more explicitly. They described the ideal brushstroke as something that moved effortlessly, as an extension of the cosmos itself. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It's cooked-ding's knife translated into ink and paper, The brush doesn't move because the calligrapher forces it. It moves because the calligrapher has felt the natural rhythm of the wrist, the weight and flow of the ink, the grain and tooth of the paper, and surrendered to all of them simultaneously. The spaces of no resistance, found not in an ox but in the relationship between hand and paper and the empty space where a character is about to appear. Wu Wei with a brush. The best calligraphy in this tradition doesn't look like the calligrapher was trying. It looks like the characters wrote themselves. And then there's Basho. Matsuo Basho, the 17th century Japanese poet who single-handedly transformed haiku from a light-hearted literary game, clever wordplay, seasonal jokes, the party tricks of educated men, into something that could hold genuine philosophical and emotional weight. Before Basho, haiku was entertainment. After Basho, it was art. And the bridge between those two things was, in significant part, Zhuangzi. Scholars have traced Basho's most important ideas directly to the Zhuangzi. His concept of carefree wandering, Xiaoyaoyu, comes straight from Chapter 1, from the peng bird and the wind and the absence of fixed destination. And his most celebrated journeys, those long, solitary walks through Japan's mountains and countryside that produced some of the greatest poetry written in any language, were explicitly modeled on Zhuangzi's ideal of purposeless travel, not trying to arrive anywhere. Not trying to achieve anything, just moving through the world and noticing what the world offers and trusting that the poems will come when the walking is honest. His most famous haiku, the one about a frog jumping into an old pond, captures something very close to Zhuangzi's sensibility. An ordinary moment, a small splash, and suddenly the silence around it becomes enormous. That's the piping of heaven, isn't it? The invisible breath heard through the shape of a frog in a pond. Basho didn't approach the Zhuangzi as a philosophical artifact from another civilization to be studied and footnoted. He treated it as a manual for how to live, how to see, how to be present enough to write the kind of line that makes a reader stop breathing for a moment. And then, and this part honestly still surprises me every time I think about it, there's the Matrix. The Wachowskis, who built the franchise, named Zhuangzi among the philosophical influences behind the film, and the connection didn't stay buried in some DVD bonus feature. In the Matrix comic series 2, there's an entire story called Butterfly. It cuts back and forth between a rain-soaked chase with agents, guns, broken glass, the usual chaos, and a serene image of Zhuangzi sitting in quiet meditation. A single butterfly drifts through both scenes, through the gunfire, through the meditation, through both realities, until the two worlds fold into each other and the question of which one is real becomes visually, narratively unanswerable. 2,400 years, from bamboo strips in a despised state to bullet time and leather coats and sunglasses, and a man in an interrogation room asking, "What is the Matrix?" The butterfly made it all the way from the mud of song to a Hollywood soundstage, and it didn't even have to try. The parable went from something you'd discuss in a seminar room to something you'd watch in IMAX with a bucket of popcorn, and the transition feels natural. The butterfly dream was always cinematic, two realities, overlapping, impossible to separate. It was waiting for film. And what strikes me about the butterfly comic isn't just the visual parallel, it's the emotional one. In the original parable, the transition between man and butterfly is gentle, seamless, you don't even notice the seam. In the comic, the two realities, the agent chase and the meditation, become harder and harder to separate until the violence and the stillness are happening in the same frame, which is, if you think about it, exactly what the dream does. The boundaries aren't dramatic. They're quiet, they dissolve while you're not looking. A philosopher who refused a kingdom to keep fishing, who told stories about butchers and skulls and useless trees, and his ideas ended up shaping how people paint mountains, how they write 17-syllable poems, how they move their bodies in parks at dawn, and how a billion-dollar science fiction franchise frames the question of what's real. The butterfly has been remarkably busy for something that might not exist. A butterfly flutters through a painting, a poem, a movie, and now, in the strangest turn of all, through a physics lab. In the 20th century, a French philosopher named Maurice Merleau-Ponty developed an idea he called flesh. Not flesh in the biological sense, flesh as a philosophical concept, a way of describing the relationship between body and world. His argument was radical for its time and remains difficult now. The body and the world are not two separate substances that happen to bump into each other. They are woven from the same material. Your hand touching a table isn't a subject contacting an object across a gap. It's one fold of the world's fabric pressing against another fold of the same fabric. Touch and being touched happen simultaneously. You can't isolate the toucher from the touched. There isn't a space between them where one ends and the other begins. Scholars comparing this to the Zhuangzi found the parallel almost eerie. Zhuangzi's concept of qi, vital energy, the breath-like force that pervades and connects everything, maps closely onto what Merleau-Ponty was reaching for with flesh. The body isn't a container for the self. The self isn't a ghost piloting a machine made of meat. They are the same fabric, perceived from different angles, two descriptions of one continuous weave, two names for one breath. And then there's Heidegger. Martin Heidegger developed the concept of ready to hand, the observation that when you're genuinely skilled with a tool, the tool disappears from your awareness. A carpenter hammering doesn't think about the hammer. The hammer vanishes into the action. It becomes an invisible extension of the carpenter's intention, of the body, of the wood being shaped. You only notice the tool again when it breaks, when it malfunctions, when it jams, and suddenly you're holding a useless piece of metal instead of participating in seamless work. That experience, the vanishing tool, the seamless absorption of instrument into action, is Cook Ding's knife. Exactly, Ding doesn't see his blade anymore. The knife, the hand, the ox, and the empty spaces between them all collapse into one continuous gesture. There's no gap where Ding ends and the knife begins, or where the knife ends and the ox starts. It's all one motion. Heidegger needed decades and thousands of pages of dense philosophical prose to articulate what was happening in that experience. Zhuangzi did it with a story about a man in a kitchen, and the story, honestly, is clearer. He arrived at embodied pre-reflective awareness, awareness that lives in the body before the mind can name it, 2 millennia before European philosophy invented the words for it. He didn't have the vocabulary. He had a butcher and a knife and an ox and the empty spaces between. And now we reach the widest ring, the outermost circle, where the concentric rings of meaning radiating out from that 90-word parable finally touch something that makes even careful thinkers nervous. Carlo Rovelli is an Italian theoretical physicist who has spent much of his career developing a framework called relational quantum mechanics. The core idea is deceptively simple to state and genuinely difficult to absorb. No physical object has absolute properties. A particle doesn't have a definite position, or a definite momentum, or a definite spin, until it interacts with another system that measures it. And measured is itself misleading. What happens is that two systems interact, and the particle's state exists only relative to the system observing it. Not the particle is here, but the particle is here relative to this particular observer. A different observer, interacting differently, might find the particle somewhere else entirely. And there is no master observer, no God's eye view, no camera outside the system that settles what the particle really is in itself, apart from any relationship. This is not a metaphor, it is the mathematics. At the most fundamental level of physical reality that physics can describe, things do not have fixed, intrinsic natures. They have relationships. A thing is what it is only relative to what it's interacting with. Change the relationship and you change the thing. Philosophers of science have noticed the structural parallel with Zhuangzi, and it's haunting in its precision. The butterfly dream dissolves the boundary between dreamer and dreamed. You can't say which is real, because real depends on which side of the dream you're asking from. Relational quantum mechanics dissolves the boundary between observer and observed. You can't say what a particle is, because is depends on who is looking. In both cases, what seems like a solid, objective boundary, I am here, the world is over there, turns out to be a perspective. A relationship, not an illusion, but not a wall either, more like a fold, two sides of the same fabric touching. And maybe that's where the butterfly dream was always headed, not toward an answer, not toward some revelatory final moment where a voice tells you whether you're the man or the butterfly and you can relax, but toward a way of being in which the question gently loses its urgency. Where you realize that the boundary you've been trying to locate all through this long, quiet evening, between dreamer and dreamed, between self and world, between waking and sleeping, between one side of something and the other, was never a boundary. It was a perspective, a shape that the breath of the cosmos happened to be passing through on its way to the next shape, and the next, and the next. Zhuangzi wrote 90 words 24 centuries ago, and those 90 words turned out to be a door that opens in every direction, or possibly in no direction at all, because directions need a fixed point to measure from, and fixed points are exactly what the transformation of things dissolves. The dream was never about figuring out which side you're on. It was about realizing there are no sides, just the turning, just the change, just the breath passing through one shape after another, each one as real and as temporary as a butterfly visiting a flower it will never visit again. And if you're lying here now, feeling the weight of your body against the bed, feeling the thoughts beginning to loosen their edges and wander, feeling that strange and familiar softening that comes when the day finally lets go of you, you're already in the space Zhuangzi was describing. Not the waking side, not the dreaming side, the place between them where one thing quietly becomes something else and neither name quite fits. That's not a puzzle to be solved. It's not a problem with a solution waiting at the bottom. It's just where you are, where you've always been, the place the butterfly was trying to show you all along. 24 centuries of philosophy and the question is still open. The butterfly is still in the air, and wherever you go tonight, into sleep, into dreams, into that space between where the names stop working, you'll be carrying Zhuangzi's 90 words with you, whether you remember them or not. They've been waiting for you. If you'd like to spend more nights like this one, thinking quietly about ideas that don't rush, we'll be here when you come back.